When the original Splatoon made its debut into the world in 2015, it was hailed by many as being a revolutionary shooter, a reinvention that could be done with the genre if you will. Instead of the focus being placed primarily on kills, the focus was instead shifted towards inking territory, altering the dynamics of play rather significantly from other shooters. The novelty of being able to switch on the fly from a slick damage-dealing kid to a sneaky nimble squid was quite unlike anything else at the time, but what really came out of nowhere for a lot of people was Splatoon's single-player mode. Unlike a lot of shooter campaigns at the time, it was actually fairly decent, praised for its creative level design and usage of the game's mechanics, even garnering some favorable comparisons to revered titles like Super Mario Galaxy from some critics. And while I never actually played through to the end of the original Splatoon's campaign, I was always intrigued to go back and see if I was missing out on something great. So when released to critical acclaim, coming with a single player mode that was also said to be amazing up there with the best 3D platformers, specifically Super Mario Galaxy and Super Mario Sunshine, I just knew I had to get my hands on it, so I did so. And the only thing I have to say after finishing it from beginning to end and taking part in a couple of repeat playthroughs to form a well-informed opinion is that anyone who had the gall to compare or say this game is on the same level as Super Mario Galaxy or even Super Mario Sunshine needs to get their head checked, or play those games again. I think they're really heavily downplaying the quality of those games when they compare them to Splatoon 2's single player mode. It just kind of shows a lack of understanding of why those games are so spectacular. But all that aside, let's get to the meat of things. To start off, full disclosure, I don't think Splatoon 2's single player mode is bad. In fact, it's decent, with some of its strengths coming from its rather brisk nature which allows players to speedrun through most levels. I'm also aware that with Splatoon's multiplayer focus, the single player wasn't going to be allocated nearly as many resources to it during development. With all that said though, I don't think that should excuse criticism of a single player mode that isn't as good as it could be. There's a lot of untapped potential and missteps in Splatoon 2's single player mode, and the more I played it, the more apparent those issues have become. As a matter of fact, as soon as you enter the first area of the story mode, a dissonance is created. This dissonance being the way Splatoon presents its world in the multiplayer and the way it presents its world in the single player. You see, to understand why I dislike this, we need to understand how Splatoon presents its world and every other aspect of the game. So let's go all the way back to the title screen. Upon entering the game, you're greeted to a news report from the famous Inkling idols themselves, Pearl and Marina. These two give you a layout of the maps available for that particular moment in time, and also happen to give information on new updates, new weapons, new Splatfests, and the schedule for Splatoon 2's Horde mode, Salmon Run. These facts easily could have been presented in a large text box as you scroll through in the main menu like many other online games do, but instead Splatoon goes the extra mile to immerse the player into its world. And once the news report ends, the player is given the interactive hub world of Inkopolis to traverse, which is brimming with life and activity, and shows Inklings socializing on the streets, drawings from the online community, Pearl and Marina chatting it up, shops containing weapons and gear that are actually physical locations the player can see and walk into, references to the previous game, and an arcade music machine that's entirely there for fun. Oh, and there's also a building that has no discernible entry or exit point, which leads one to wonder if the people inside there are trapped or not. Yeah, but whatever. What I'm getting at here is that there's a whole lot of world building and contextualization at work here, and oh boy, it doesn't stop there, the rabbit hole goes even deeper. Upon entering a map in multiplayer, it's obvious that the maps have a clear sense of location and presence within Splatoon's world. Take Port Mackerel for example. It's by the sea as the name would naturally imply, and it's got forklift trucks perpetually moving around the shipping yard, with some trucks even gaining guidance from the jellyfish workers. There's even container cranes which load shipping containers onto the nearby ship, and a helicopter that hovers over the port. And lastly, to sell the whole image, there's warehouses and shipping containers as far as the eye can see, with even more jellyfish seen on site. As you can see, the map here expands the scope of Inkling society initially presented by Splatoon in its hub world by giving itself character and filling itself with detail. And Port Mackerel isn't even the most richly portrayed map in the game. All one needs to do is look at Inkblot Art Academy to see how in-depth these maps can be. In Inkblot, the player is fully put into an urban academic center and can see jellyfish painting on canvases, Inkling sculptures in the area, a Vitruvian jellyfish, jellyfish sleeping, a jellyfish diligently working on a computer, jellyfish caring about their daily lives, and a bus drive by in the background. All this creates a distinctive atmosphere for Splatoon and helps make a world that not only feels lived in, but also celebrates urban society and culture. Everything has a distinct sense of place, and it all works within the context the game gives that Inkopolis is a bustling metropolis. And even when the game deviates from that idea, it gives justification for said deviation. For example, Splatoon 2's Horde mode, Salmon Run, is contextualized as being a mundane part-time job in the game world, and as such it takes place on remote, offshore facilities separate from Inkopolis. Salmon Run even has the numerous background details I talked about previously in the other maps, but instead of going for the ideal urban paradise vibe that the regular multiplayer maps go for, it instead goes for the polluted, man-made industrial vibe, further establishing Salmon Run as a deviation, while still making it feel like it fits in within the wider context of Splatoon's world. But you see, all this world building is thrown out the window once you enter the single player. Octo Valley is primarily where the single player takes place, and it's fittingly different to the other locations in the game because it primarily takes place underground. For those unfamiliar with Splatoon's lore, it's stated that the Octarians, the primary antagonists to the Inklings in the story mode, live in Octo Valley after losing the Great Turf War between Inklings and Octarians many years in the past. To survive, the Octarians created kettles, which lead people into their underground dome-like societies, and also feature artificial constructions that simulate the real world, like TV screens that show environments that would normally be found on the surface, and a lamp that acts as a sun for those living there in the dome. On paper, I like this idea. It's radically different from the other locales in the game, and the idea of Octo Valley being a crater in the middle of the ocean that leads to numerous underground structures is neat. But there is an issue here that ruins it greatly and kind of makes adventures in Octo Valley feel inconsistent with the rest of the game. This issue being the fact that the player primarily traverses through Octo Valley on floating platforms, something that isn't really present in any other facet of Splatoon, making it feel pretty out of place. Of course, you could reason out why the floating platforms are there, as the Octarians being more proficient with technology than the Inklings, so there are some things in Octarian society that you simply wouldn't see in Inkling society, which would make sense and can be seen in some of the later stages for sure, but it feels like a bit of a bad excuse in this particular case. The floating platforms are most definitely primarily used to produce interesting gameplay challenges more than anything else, because as we know, Nintendo's entertainment, analysis, and development groups have the idea come not from the design but from the function. The design comes after, which is a great way to design a game, as proven by Nintendo themselves numerous times in the past, present, and probably future. I don't have a problem with this skewing logic or consistency to create a fun experience. In fact, I think this is the best way to do it if it leads to the most enjoyable experience possible. But the problem with Splatoon's floating platforms is that it really doesn't add much to the experience gameplay wise, while also not fitting in all that well with the established world of Splatoon. It feels like through the floating platforms they tried to make a platformer as well as a shooter, which can work, it's been proven to be possible before, but here in Splatoon it doesn't excel at either aspect. The shooting here doesn't play the strengths of Splatoon's Ink absolutely everything shooting mechanics, and the platforming doesn't compensate for the Inkling's lack of mobility in comparison to most characters in a typical platformer. Since you're only extremely mobile as a squid, it doesn't really make for a lot of interesting or unique platforming sections when you're a kid, which is a fair bit at the time. To fix this issue, they should have made the levels more ground-based, akin to the multiplayer map, so you can, actually use the paint mechanic this game focuses on in multiplayer more effectively. And I don't mean they should use maps the size of multiplayer maps to accomplish this. Ideally, these single-player maps be much larger and have a greater focus on multiple pathways to reach a destination using ink to traverse the landscape. But you might be wondering, if they weren't going to use the floating platforms, where would the setting be for these levels? Well, to better fit in with the established lore, the levels would take place within the caverns of Octo Valley. And within those dug-in caverns there would be kettles, like we see on the floating platforms, but when you enter them, instead of being sent to a floating world that really doesn't make sense, or give us perspective on how Octarian society is, you would be sent to one of their cities or what have you to fight Octarians on their home turf, while also giving us insight into Octarian society. And while this may seem like a preposterous idea, if you look inside many of the levels in the game, you see Octarian cities below the floating platforms you play on. It's a bit weird, and a great loss of potential. The game states you're going on Octarian turf to fight them directly, but you never really get the sense you're fighting on land the Octarians would use to live, eat, sleep, have fun, or even patrol on as outposts of sorts. It just kind of screams poorly executed to me, especially considering how well other facets of Splatoon's world are portrayed in the multiplayer. In addition to these problems, there's also the fact that the enemy variety is lacking in general. Many of the basic enemies are reused throughout the campaign with maybe some minor alterations to them by the end of the journey. The Octarian enemies here pale in comparison to Salmon Run's Salmonids, which are noticeably more aggressive, distinct, and varied than anything you'll find in the single player, and because the single player is lackluster enemies, there aren't really many interesting scenarios to overcome outside of boss battles, which are pretty solid. Even the levels where the Octolings show up are rather dull because they provide little to no challenge whatsoever, arguably being even easier to deal with than the regular levels. To alleviate this issue, they should have mixed Octolings among other encounters with standard enemies more than they already do to spice things up a bit. But all that aside for a moment, there was one thing I was thinking about the most as I was playing through this mode of missed opportunities. I was thinking this would be so much better if it were just a little bit more like Ratchet and Clank. A series that has nailed its platformer shooter style for ages now. If the Splatoon team just took a couple concepts from Ratchet and Clank and applied some of their own twist on it to make it their own, the single player would be exceptional. For example, instead of only having the option to choose one weapon you will use to play through the entirety of a level, with some levels clearly being designed with the usage of certain weapons in mind, why not instead have a radial weapon wheel like Ratchet and Clank does, so you can switch weapons on the fly and not be pigeonholed to a specific playstyle? Instead of making upgrades to weapons something you must trek all the way back to the starting area to pay power eggs to obtain, why not instead have weapon upgrades be something you get through usage, eliminating the rather pointless step of having to go and upgrade things manually in the first place? How about instead of giving an absurdly small amount of power eggs for defeating enemies in the single player, they improve the game feel, the intangible tactile sensation experience when interacting with video games that makes performing actions in the game feel satisfying by showering you with power eggs upon defeating an enemy, like how Ratchet and Clank showers you with satisfying to collect bolts upon defeating an enemy. And the funny thing about that idea in particular is that Salmon Run already does this by giving a large influx of power eggs with every strike at an enemy in Salmon Run, but the single player doesn't do this for no discernible reason and to its own detriment. It's just a weird and bad idea to only give the player 1 or 2 power eggs regularly and 5 or 10 when they get lucky. It'd be much better if they gave players 50 or so power eggs all at once to create a more satisfying experience overall. It's things like that, in conjunction with the things I previously detailed, such as the dissonance in the world and the rough implementation of certain gameplay ideas, that makes Splatoon 2 single player mode feel like wasted potential. A mode that neither excels in shooting or platforming and only ends up mildly better than the shooter campaigns that we're used to now in this era. Splatoon has a lot of promise for a sublime single player mode, but without a true expansion upon the formula created by the first Splatoon, it won't be anything more than just a decent distraction.